the dance party. Come on, Steve. Wait.
What you drinking, Joy?
Water. Hey guys, this is Steph Joy with Real Progressives. So tonight we have a pretty badass show. Super excited that I have three amazing people who are going to be joining me. As you guys know, Nancy Pelosi is up for re-election. Some people are, really about term limits. Some people, I'd say the majority of people, especially progressives, are ready to get her out and get someone else in there, hopefully a progressive who actually, speaks for we the people. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to have a debate with the three Dems who are taking her on. And California is a jungle primary. So what that means is the top two people who get the most votes will go on to the general. And when they proceed, it could be two Republicans, it could be a Green and an independent, regardless of party. The two with the highest votes will move on. So this is a really important election, of course. Last time in 2018, we were disappointed. So this time we got to kick ass and send her packing. So tonight is also important. Unfortunately, I do have some bad news. Nancy Pelosi herself has not responded to my many requests, but also her spokespeople have not either, unfortunately. But we're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna have our own democracy. That's actual democracy. So I'm gonna introduce those three candidates who are taking her on. So first we have Agatha Bacelar. Thank you so much for joining us, Agatha.
Thank you for having me. It's so historic to have this kind of conversation.
Absolutely. The next person we're having is Tom Gallagher. Hi, Tom.
Hi, thank you as well. The fact that somebody from Pennsylvania is taking this on is pretty amazing.
Heck yeah. And our last guest is Shahid Buttar. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm excited to be with you, Joy. Thanks for bringing us together.
Absolutely. So to everyone watching, this is really important, not just for people in California. Like Tom said, I'm in Pennsylvania. This is really important for our entire country because Pelosi is someone who is arguably the most powerful Dem right now, especially because she kind of pulls a lot of the shots in many ways. That being said, should we get someone progressive in her place, we could look forward to a lot of changes. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to have the three candidates. They're each going to be given 3 minutes to share whatever they'd like, a bit of their background and why they're running. So Agatha, would you like to start?
Sure thing. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Agatha Bacelar. And like you said, Joy, this election is so important. And I'm running to challenge Nancy Pelosi and the political establishment because I believe how our political system works and how the US makes decisions as a global leader is a matter of survival for the planet and humanity. My vision with this campaign is to be a revolutionary, progressive candidate that fights for ambitious policies like Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. But I also think to advance those things that we want, we need to redesign our political system to be more responsive and reflective of the people. So that means upgrading our democracy to the 21st century, to use tools that allow people to provide their input in real time. As for some of my background that might help frame the rest of the conversation, I am a 27-year-old Brazilian American immigrant. I studied design and engineering at Stanford. And I helped start a nonprofit called Democracy Earth. And what I learned in working at the intersection of democracy and the internet is that it all boils down to representation and power. People want to feel empowered and like their voice matters, that it has institutional value. So it might take some time to get there, but I want to be a member of Congress that makes decisions informed by how constituents vote on an open source digital platform, instead of us waiting for democracy or an election every few years. The other part of my background is that I was working on documentary filmmaking and political advocacy across a variety of social justice issues. And my job, I spent very little time in an office, and most of it was in the field with the people and in the places where justice is most urgently needed, from locked facilities like prisons and juvenile camps to immigrant detention, to working with our unbanked and undocumented communities. So I'm running because I'm haunted by what I've seen, and people let me into their homes and told me these stories that I feel need to be brought to Congress, because the reality in Congress does not match what's happening on the ground. So ultimately, the status quo must go.
Awesome. Shahid?
So the reason I'm in this race is because over the 20 years that I've been an advocate for civil rights and civil liberties, I've watched our concerns as advocates for the public interest, for climate justice, concerns about universal healthcare, concerns about following Dr. King's call and exhortation to challenge the intersecting evils of militarism, of capitalism, and of racism. I've seen our calls for justice fall on the deaf ears of careerists for entirely too long. And I'm not someone who has political aspirations. I have a great deal of political frustration and even more political preparation. So for 6 years, I ran a national nonprofit called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. It was founded under the Bush administration to fight the Patriot Act. Before that, I launched a program for another national nonprofit called Muslim Advocates to basically address racial and religious profiling, particularly by the FBI. My litigation career included the first case seeking marriage equality for same-sex couples in the state of New York. That was 2004, about a decade before Speaker Pelosi showed up to defend the rights of our LGBTQ neighbors. And I did that as a cis hetero Muslim lawyer, vindicating civil rights wherever they are threatened. That's been my MO over the course of my career. I was very much part of the Occupy movement in many different cities. I've been very active in the movement for Black Lives, the immigrant rights movement, the peace and justice movement, and the anti-globalization movement before that, which is to say, over the last 20 years, wherever there has been a social movement challenging entrenched power, and particularly capital, I have been there. Wherever there has been a community that has been struggling with corporate or government abuses, I've been there. The most recent highlight of my work included the nation's first municipal ban on the use of face surveillance technology by government agencies. That happened here in San Francisco. I've been working on that campaign since its inception, and indeed well before that discrete campaign started. And as an intersectional feminist who promotes justice across the various places it's threatened through an interdisciplinary set of tools and strategies, I'm very eager to offer my city a new voice in Congress that's better aligned with our proud commitments to peace and justice, to climate justice, to inclusion and equity, and to preserving a future for life on this only planet that we have.
Right on. And Tom?
Good evening. The quickest way, I think, to give a thumbnail of my politics is to say that I was an elected Bernie Sanders delegate to the 2016 Democratic Convention, and I hold the positions that go along with that. In fact, I like to think of myself as someone who was a member of the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party before there was a Bernie Sanders wing in the Democratic Party. There's one other issue I'd like to raise, though, that's not part of that. I'm promoting the notion of a Marshall Plan for Central America as a long-term solution for the asylum crisis currently happening on our current border. The border, I should say. I'm going to talk about that obviously later. Background, I have been elected in the past in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. I served as the chair of the Progressive Caucus there. Subsequently, I chaired the Boston chapter of Democratic Socialists of America. When I moved to San Francisco in 1994, the first thing I did was work on the staff of Proposition 186, which was a California single-payer healthcare bill. It failed miserably, but it carried one county, San Francisco. And over these 25 years, the representative of San Francisco has never filed a federal legislation, never signed on to it for a single-payer healthcare system. So I've had an axe to grind sort of since I got here. Have subsequently been a president of a local Democratic club. I've chaired the Progressive Democrats of America. And for better than the past decade, I've attempted to hound Nancy Pelosi on foreign policy. In 2008, I wrote a ballot question that declared its city policy that congressional representatives vote no further funding for the Iraq War, something that didn't have a great deal of impact on Pelosi. Last year, I was a delegate to the California Democratic Convention, an amendment to the party platform calling for no further funding for the Afghanistan war. Again, nothing happened. One other note on last year's election, people might not know too much about it. 2018 was a fiasco for San Francisco Progressive. Had three Democrats run to Pelosi's left, then $225,000, split the vote. A Republican made the runoff with 9%. So I have suggested the idea of a progressive primary, by which I simply mean some democratic method to line up behind a single challenger. For my campaign, I am taking no contributions greater than $200 cumulatively, so as to try not to participate in the waste of money that was futilely spent in the last campaign. And I look forward to the rest of the evening.
Right on. Well, thank you all. This is already setting up to be an awesome debate. So just for our audience watching, we've already kind of gone over the rules, but for the audience watching, what we're going to do is I am going to ask each candidate a question. They're going to get 2 minutes to answer, and then each other candidate will get a 1 minute time to respond to the initial candidate's answer. Oh, and I also forgot to mention that Pelosi has never done a debate in like the 18 years she's, been in office. So I think she's kind of scared.
She's never done a debate in 30 years. That's right.
Oh my gosh. I think she's scared to like be confronted about things, or just very pompous.
Doesn't feel she has to. Hasn't had a serious race, I think, since Harry Britt when she first got elected.
Wow. So we are ready to rock with the questions. Well, first of all, let's say now that we have some of your backgrounds, what is the reason you decided to run? Like the overall reason why you came to that decision, I'm going to put my name in, I'm going to run. Tom?
This is something I've thought about for a long time. I thought that Pelosi should have some kind of serious challenge, obviously, that made it to the final. What made me finally decide to do it is the expectation that this would be her last run. That's what we understand. If she were to win, as is generally expected, the next race would be the usual one that we will have in this town, and most cities do. What you did this, you're taking this person's money, et cetera, et cetera. This time, if we can get past the Republican and finally get a Democrat in the final, which has never happened, amazingly, we can have a race that lines up essentially the Sanders wing of the party against the corporate establishment wing of the party. It's a race that will get, at the least, an unusual amount of national attention because it's Nancy Pelosi. Whether we can win it or not, obviously, I didn't enter this race because I felt sure of that. I think one has to be nuts to be sure of it. But I'm sure that we can have a meaningful race, the way that has not been had before.
Agatha, you have a 1-minute response?
Yeah, I decided to run because of the urgency of it. Climate change was one of the reasons. I think it's one of the most important issues. And also, I had taken some time off my normal job last year and had done a voter registration project across many states, which was really just an excuse to talk to hundreds of people about the state of democracy. And I was really trying to get the millennial vote out and the Latino vote. And so I just felt so frustrated that people discounted our generation as apathetic or lazy, when really it's just that we're smart enough to know that our voice gets drowned out by corporate interests. And I felt like we are living in a historic moment where first-time, more diverse candidates can run, win, and be effective. And I felt like my background was the one that would inspire a new electorate to come out, and that would represent the demographics of San Francisco, which are predominantly tech workers, immigrants, and millennials.
Shahid?
So I was recruited in 2018 to run, and I ran last year, and I emerged from the crowded field that Tom described as the leading progressive challenger to the speaker. And so this year, it was, frankly, something of a no-brainer to continue. I ran in the same cycle, for instance, as Representative Ocasio-Cortez, on the same platform, essentially on the opposite side of the country. Our campaign got 1,000 more votes than their campaign did in our respective primaries. That wasn't enough to break through. And having established that result in 3 months without any media attention in 2018, it made a great deal of sense to continue the quest to run for the second cycle. Tom referenced the national attention that this race will, in fact, has already received. The reason we have over 4,000 donors from every state in the union, plus DC and Puerto Rico, I think, is because this is a national race. Speaker Pelosi is, for better or worse, fueling Republican conservative policies on too many issues. And I think a great many Americans are concerned, and they see in our voice in this campaign a credible alternative to take the seat, to liberate it, and to represent San Francisco's proud voice in Washington.
All right. So actually, kind of on that note, how do you feel about term limits? We can give a 1-minute answer, yay or nay. Shahid?
So there's different term limits to consider. I have a proposal for judicial term limits, 18-year staggered terms for Supreme Court justices. With respect to legislative offices, legislative term limits have a number of unfortunate consequences. One of them is that they tend to knock people out of legislatures right as they establish expertise. On the other hand, I don't think that legislative service should be a career. I think that legislative service should be a service. And when someone, frankly, is no longer representing the voice of their constituency, another voice should emerge. I think that term limits are an unfortunate way of trying to achieve something that is more important that stands behind it, and that is turnover in legislatures. The way to establish that, I think, is campaign finance reform, to ensure that working people have an influence and an opportunity to influence not just the political process, but the candidate selection process, in which currently only 2% of Americans participate. So I think that term limits are a not ideal solution to a very real problem that we can better pursue with more carefully tailored means.
Tom?
I don't support term limits. I really don't have that much more to say about it. I understand the frustration that, oh, let's get rid of this guy. However, but I don't know of any evidence that it is effective in getting people that you want to get rid of more often than people you don't want to get rid of. Bernie Sanders is an example of somebody who was still with us because we don't have limits. I think it behooves all of us to share that in mind.
And Agatha?
Right. I think in this case, Speaker Pelosi has been in office for longer than I've been alive. And in that time, San Francisco has changed dramatically. And in this case, yeah, I think there needs to be a way to refresh the system and ensure that new voices are heard. But I also feel like the reason that it's so frustrating is campaign finance reform. It's so daunting to run for office. And once you're in office, you're more preoccupied with getting reelected. And so then you focus on a donor base and you lose touch with who your true constituents are.
Okay, the next question is going to be about BDS and Israel. So let's do 2-minute answers on, do you support BDS? What was your impression of the outcome? Were you surprised how people voted? Agatha, do you want to start?
Right. So I think boycott, divestments, and sanctions is an organizing tactic that was very effective in ending the South African apartheid movement. And I completely disagree with Congress outlawing it. You shouldn't outlaw freedom of speech or an organizing tactic. I was surprised, but maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by how basically everyone in Congress except the squad voted to outlaw it. But then you look at certain influencing interests, and I think, knowledge is power. And if elected, I would like to be part of a new tradition that where the freshman class not only visits Israel, but gets to visit Palestine as well, see both sides.
Shahid?
I've long supported the BDS movement. I've been to Palestine. I visited the West Bank in the fall of 2015. And having had a firsthand experience of the denial of human rights in Israel, frankly, the willingness to violate international human rights commitments that our country proudly fought for in a world war that we now abandon effectively in the service of supporting a proxy power, it's more than unfortunate. And with respect to the BDS proposal in Congress, it is flatly unconstitutional, and we should recognize that we play with these powers. We accept authoritarian restrictions on speech at great peril, and they might seem to serve particular interests in any one time slice, but inevitably, restrictions on speech blow back to harm Americans and working people. The idea that we would tolerate the proposal to restrict the speech of Americans to protect the human rights violations of a proxy power abroad turns our Constitution on its head. I dare say, in particular, President Eisenhower would roll in his grave, because he warned us about the domestic military industrial complex. What I think the apartheid state in Israel particularly makes very clear is that our military industrial complex has jumped the international shark, and it's no longer a strictly US phenomenon. That makes it especially not only dangerous, but important to challenge and curtail at every opportunity. That includes protecting the rights of Americans to participate in boycotts and divestment sanctions opportunities and actions.
And Tom?
The BDS strategy is, in my view, perfectly reasonable. And of course, the idea of Congress ruling it out is ridiculous. But what is more important, it seems to me, for people who would aspire to be in Congress, what should Congress be doing in regard to the situation? We have laws on the books that say we are not supposed to be given foreign aid. We are not supposed to be giving military aid, selling military equipment to human rights violators. We should hold Israel to that standard. We should hold every country to that standard. The difficulty, of course, is always the question of whether Israel is being treated separately. It should be treated the same. We do this for no one at this point. Saudi Arabia, for instance, their human rights standards should be examined. Every country in the world that we give military aid to, which is most of the countries in the world, we need to ask that question. That is what people looking to go to Congress should be discussing, it seems to me, with the general public, and turning the discussion to what's Washington's.
So on that note, also, I know the news has been about Ilhan and Rashida not being able to go to Israel, but backtracking, when it's all about the Benjamins, Ilhan posted that, and it was blown into being anti-Semitic, and Nancy Pelosi behaved egregiously, never stuck up for them. How how would you have done things differently? Agatha, do you want to start?
Sure. I think that's something that probably frustrates all of us who are tuning in, is how dismissive Speaker Pelosi is to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I think there's this foolish belief that the reason we won the House for Democrats was because we won these centrist seats, and that's where we need to go forward and have this incrementalist approach. But actually, it was progressive energy that mobilized and went door knocking and organ canvassing to elect candidates. And so that is actually the winning strategy. And especially for a cohort of young women of color who are duly not represented in Congress. I mean, only 20% of Congress still is women. As the first female speaker of the House, I think Pelosi should know better than to be dismissive.
Shahid?
In terms of how I do things differently, when Speaker Pelosi came after the squad, the first time I had the opportunity to visit Washington, and I visited Representative Omer's office. Among the people who've endorsed our campaign is Linda Sarsour, the co-chair of the Women's March. And I think one of the reasons she endorsed us is because we were there showing solidarity with Ilhan in person at a time when it mattered a great deal. In Congress, I would be very much a voice allied with the squad. And just to press a point here, one of the reasons that Representatives Omar, Ocasio-Cortez, and Tlaib are demonized by the right wing is because they are so incredibly effective. Even without legislative majorities, they've been able to leverage the oversight process to shake loose facts, narratives, to challenge bipartisan consensuses, for instance, on human rights violations in Latin America, right? When she had the opportunity to interrogate Elliot Abrams, the Reagan-era war criminal, and exposed the litany of crimes that our military-industrial complex has been complicit in across the global South, that was the kind of maneuver by a member of Congress that Washington has not seen in a generation. The last person who showed up like that in Congress was Senator Mike Gravel. And I'm very eager to continue that proud tradition of members of Congress who understand what the oath of office means, members of Congress who understand the separation of powers, and members of Congress who are committed to the very first job of Congress, which is to check and balance the executive branch.
And I digress, but did you mention Linda Sarsour?
Yeah, Linda Sarsour is one of the people who endorsed our campaign. It was maybe a month or two ago.
Send her my love.
I will, absolutely. She's a stalwart.
Sorry, I digress, but I was like, ooh, Linda. Anyway, back to you, Tom.
Okay, well, I do want to make the observation that none of us will be speaker if we get elected. So people are thinking of her from outside in a different way than the replacement would be. That having been said, do I think she was particularly respectful to them? No, I don't. What would be different? Again, I wouldn't be speaker, nor would any of the others on the panel tonight. A close colleague, obviously. I'm from the Bronx. I take a great amount of pride, therefore, in Ocasio-Cortez representing the borough, a different district than I grew up in. But the degree to which she, in particular, has been able to have an impact as a rookie in Congress is amazing. Her role in the Green New Deal, which is far, obviously, from its success, but nonetheless is by far the most advanced piece of legislation that's been proposed to Congress is phenomenal. So what would be the difference? I would, of course, be right there with them.
The next question goes out to each of you. What was your response when Trump said that this will never be a socialist country, and Nancy did her, the cringe clap? What was your response to that, and the fact that it got a standing ovation? What was your response? Tom, would you like to continue?
Sure. Am I surprised that the president, even this guy could get a round of applause in Congress for attacking socialism? No, I am not. As we know, before Bernie Sanders ran, people didn't discuss this. I mean, I was an open socialist legislator in Massachusetts, and that was a rare item. So very few people on Capitol Hill like that. So, just more of the clown show.
Shahid?
Shahid for your reference, but yeah,
Shahid, sorry.
No worries. Yeah, my reaction to that was frankly to smirk, recognize the bipartisan complicity in for-profit crony capitalism, extractive corporate capitalism of the sort that kills Americans every day, and frankly to take some measure of glee in the president numbering his own days. At the end of the day, when we confront the emergence of kleptocracy and the fascism in Washington that is ascendant, to prevent its consolidation, we have to present a bold alternative. And socialism is exactly the alternative to the capitalist and there's so many lenses here. You can think about runaway capitalism as wars for profit. You can think about runaway capitalism as a doubling down on the fossil fuel extraction that will kill all of our grandchildren if we allow it to proceed unfettered. You could think about corporate capitalism as turning a blind eye to the thousands, if not millions of Americans who sleep outside every night. Capitalism is a sustained willingness to tolerate human rights abuses and to put profit before people. And to see a kleptocrat boldly declare that he thinks that socialism is nowhere in our country's future, I just find it amusing, frankly. And I do find the one thing I'll add to that is that to see corporate Democrats applauding him revealed, I think, the corruption that pervades Washington and exactly why Speaker Pelosi is poised to lose her seat in the next year.
And Agatha?
Yeah, it's more of the same of the burdens of labels like socialism that prevents people from having a real conversation on what that means ultimately. Socialism is thrown out as a rallying cry or a fear tactic, and it avoids the conversation that needs to be had on having a system where profits are prioritized over people, and how when we say socialism, what do we mean? We want to take care of our environment and humanity above profits. And I think that is something that almost everyone can agree with.
So the next question I'm going to go with is Venezuela. A lot of people have a lot of concern right now, rightly so. What are your feelings on it? Should we get involved? Should we not get involved? Agatha, would you like to continue?
Sure. I don't think that we should intervene militarily, but I do believe that we have diplomatic tools that we could use, soft power, or for example, some of the humanitarian crisis that's happening in Venezuela could be solved with technology. People are not being able to access their bank accounts, or there's a refugee crisis. And I think there are different tools we can use other than expanding the US's imperialist sprawl.
Tom?
Well, when the United Nations rapporteur went to Venezuela, he identified two major sources of the economic crisis. One, or perhaps I should say three. One, the decline in the price of oil. Two, the government's inability to diversify the economy. And third, the American sanctions, which have been increased at time. It's not as if I don't have concerns about the Maduro government. Michelle Bachelet's report recently had to be given who she is, the former socialist president of Chile, had to be a concern to all of us. But it is simply not our business to be trying to overthrow that government, whether by military force or by soft power. Anyone who has looked at this and any knowledge, the history of American intervention in Latin America has been ignominious. We should run entirely the other way from any involvement.
And Shahid.
The attempt to force a regime change in Venezuela reflects a continuation of a long, unfortunate, and I dare say criminal paradigm pervading our foreign policy in Washington. And it relates to fossil fuel extraction by force. There are lots of countries in the world that are beset by any number of crises. The reason that the United States has a particular interest in Venezuela is because it is the leading petroleum producer in our hemisphere. And that's all I think we need to say. Our national security apparatus and industries have a dismal record of getting it right. I mean, the last time we tried this, I mean, anybody remember what happened in Iraq, right? I mean, that we should learn from our mistakes rather than double down on them. And the idea that we would trust any voice in America's intelligence apparatus that would push us towards more war should put us all on frankly, an alarm. This is one of the reasons why it's so critical for Congress to resist executive power at the moment, because the founders of our country knew this is one of the reasons why they reserved the war-making power for Congress, is that they knew that an executive branch empowered to make war will be inclined towards demagoguery. It's an easy, predictable recipe. We saw the Bush administration use it, conduct offensive wars to rally political support behind effectively what amounts to an autocratic leader. I want neither to facilitate the human rights abuses that would inevitably emerge if we do escalate our intervention. Note that even our economic sanctions are already, as Tom said, driving a humanitarian crisis. So I want to end that. And further, I think it's absolutely imperative upon our country to shrink the Pentagon, not only to prevent these kinds of wars for profit and plunder in the future, but also to get on the other side of climate crisis. People forget that the largest institutional source of carbon pollution on our planet is the Pentagon. Moreover, what do we use it for? This is where Venezuela becomes very poignant. We use the Pentagon, we use the CIA, we use our military industrial complex to plunder other countries, usually for fossil fuels, which then exacerbates the heating of our climate. So there's an intersectional set of reasons here to be very skeptical of the voices that are calling for escalation in Venezuela.
And if you'd like to continue, my next question is, how plausible is it that a yellow vest action would happen in our country?
I think, we have to disaggregate what the action was. What really made the yellow vest action as viral as it was in France is the fact that everybody has a yellow vest in their car there. It's like a safety measure. So the real question is, what do Americans have that unite us? I think the closest thing to that would be our cell phones, perhaps. I would take it back to the Occupy movement, because I think the Occupy movement was the last time we saw something aspiring to a similar scale of what the yellow vest movement saw in France. And a lot of people said in 2011 that they might have thought the Occupy movement to be unsuccessful. And I had the same attitude then that I do, frankly, when Trump talks about socialism not being the future of the country. The Occupy movement was just the beginning. Bernie 2016 was a continuation of the Occupy movement. Ocasio-Cortez's victory in 2018 represented the maturation of the Occupy generation. We were just getting started then, and we have not yet begun to fight. There is a generational transition that is happening in the United States in slow motion under our feet. Boomers are increasingly transitioning, and millennials are already the largest generational voting bloc. They are the most progressive generation our republic has ever seen. I've been fighting for the principles that define the millennial generation since millennials were children. And I think they see in our campaign a voice that has long been fighting for the reasonable, sane policies that I think a lot of younger people have been waiting for the gerontocracy to evolve to accept. Marriage equality is just one example, right? I was fighting for that on the leading edge because it is a no-brainer to me as a civil rights person, even as it seemed unthinkable to corporate Democrats. I think the plausibility of a potential future, we have to examine what plausibility means. Plausibility is ultimately what we have the vision to put our energy into. And having seen and having helped make seemingly impossible things real before, I certainly would not put it past our country to have a yellow vest moment, though I would just push back and describe it in an alternative terms. The way I would want to see that emerge in the United States, if we do muster the gumption to organize ourselves at the neighborhood level and connect with our neighbors and rediscover the capacity to mobilize, I would like to see the working families of this country execute a general strike.
Agatha?
Yeah, I think it is possible. I think we have come to a cliff's edge of income inequality, and that disparity has gotten people desperate and are willing to, just go out into the streets and do something about it. I think the main thing that would prevent something like that is if you look at how Cambridge Analytica used tools to make people apathetic and actually check out of political systems.
Tom?
Well, I place, excuse me, no real value in my predictive power. So will there be yellow vest phenomenon in this country? I have no idea. I sure don't think there'll be a general strike, but these things always happen to surprise you. That's how they work. What I do think is we have major tasks to hammer away on in any way we can. The Green New Deal, which really is just a very broad concept, we know has to be figured out somehow. We've got a bigger one, really. We've touched upon it here and there. It's a great thing that people, and the younger you are, the more likely you are to do it. We know, realize that we can't nibble at the edges anymore. We're on this one planet, it's round, you go around, you come back to where you came from. There's no way out. And that you can't nibble away as Nancy Pelosi's wing of the party would do. But we have a much greater reluctance to realize the need to take on the military expenditure in this country and the usage of the military in this country. The so-called experts still hold great sway in a way that the anti-climate change people are mainly recognized as cranks. Recognized as cranks with backing when the oil companies and so forth get behind them. But the people who advocate for endless war are considered the intelligence community. It is much harder for people to break from that. And that's what we got to be working on. I'm not going to speculate about anybody's vests, but I think I do know what we do need to continue to do.
Fair enough. Let's see. So something that I talk to all of my California candidates about that they're always passionate about is the housing crisis. The homelessness, the fact that rents are just absolutely ridiculously astronomical. So Tom, would you like to continue and just share what plans you would attempt to implement to help the housing crisis?
Well, you mentioned the homelessness situation. Of course, it's something I put on the front of my literature. The contrast between what we fund, a couple of beautiful jet fighter bombers overhead, and the sight of our streets. And as everyone knows, San Francisco streets are scandalous in terms of the number of people living in them who have no place else to go. A large part of this is, and of course, that people, of course, blame people around them. It's the mayor's fault, the police fault. It's not any of their fault. It's a problem of national priorities. So the military budget, hey, I don't expect the Sanders administration to be able to pull this off, but a representative from California should be calling for it to be cut in half. That would open up some serious revenue for this. I think, for one thing, something that is not utilized, federal housing programs. The federal government should be building housing, and it should be doing it by appropriating the revenue for it. This is, you might consider it a financial trick, but it's more than that. What I mean is we go out and borrow for these things all the time. A lot cheaper if you just appropriate for it. But you have to have a Congress committed to this more than they are committed to shoring up the banking industry.
Agatha?
Yeah, this is absolutely a priority and one of the things that I hear most from people. Housing is a human right, and to address the homelessness problem, we need to build more housing. In San Francisco, you have the YIMBYs and the NIMBYs But even if you're yes in my backyard, what kind of housing are we building? It needs to be public housing, affordable housing. Unfortunately, I talked to, well, just from personal experience, I'm a congressional candidate and I live with 3 other housemates. And before the house I lived in now, I lived with 9 housemates in order to afford rent. I talked to some of my friends and they're so excited I'm running for Congress. And some of them say, I honestly am not sure if I'm going to be here next year because it's so expensive and can't start my life here. I need to go elsewhere. There's these myths around homelessness that, other places ship in folks, when 70% of those experiencing homelessness were formerly housed in San Francisco. I recently went to a 2-hour hearing on the Navigation Center on Embarcadero. And what I thought was missing was a sense of humanity and storytelling. So for 2 hours, we heard from people like the police department and their commitment to safety. We heard from designers on why they chose the materials or the location. And not once did you hear from someone who is currently experiencing homelessness or any sort of storytelling or statistics on who these people are, because I think there's people in San Francisco who don't want to have shelters. The image they have in their mind is of a deranged man, and yet homelessness can often be invisible. It could be a mom living out of her car with her kids. It could be a family that's recognizable to all of us. So more humanity and more housing, public housing overall.
And Shahid.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. There was some background. I was out on the street there. Thanks for being with me. San Francisco is enduring a brutal housing crisis. In some respects, it's not very different from many cities around the country. I think to some extent we have it worse than most cities. But this is a national problem, and it has a federal root. Until the late 70s, our federal government invested billions of dollars a year in providing community development block grants through HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And these were pass-through grants that gave states resources to provide incentives to property developers to include affordable units when they're building new developments. The budget for those programs, this is 2016 tax inflated dollars, or pardon me, 2016 inflation adjusted dollars. The budget for those programs fell from a late 70s high of around $13 billion a year. The current budget is $3 billion a year. That erosion happened effectively under Speaker Pelosi's watch. Our kleptocrat-in-chief's latest budget proposes to zero out that program entirely, which is to say, the call of the day, one of the questions before Congress, and I think it fits very much in line with the fight to secure Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. We also need to revive and expand the federal spending on incentives for affordable housing. It's not that complicated. The Joint Strike Fighter, the only place, I guess, with respect to Tom's answer before that I particularly disagree with is the characterization of bombs or fighter planes is beautiful, but I think he and I agree that they are at least a boondoggle. And the fact that we have a weapons program that will cost over its life cycle $1.5 trillion, this is for a plane that can't fly in the rain, for a plane that can't possibly meet our national security objectives. It's already obsolete before they've even finished designing the thing. Do you know how much housing we could build for $1.5 trillion? That would allow the expansion of the affordable housing investment by multiple orders of magnitude beyond the 1970s high that we have fallen from precipitously. So this is just another example of where our spending priorities reflect the bipartisan consensus on corporate rule and the commitment to putting corporations before communities. It's exactly one of the reasons why I want to run for Congress and why I want to serve in the body to help establish not only housing as a human right, but also healthcare, food, and access to equal opportunity. These are all human rights, clean water, clean air. Socialism ultimately is about expanding the set of rights in the face of a structure that, to this point, has been entirely too willing to distribute resources only according to exchange and profit.
And one of the things that people complain about the most about Pelosi is that she essentially is very Republican-ish. So she capitulates to them. Now, when you're in office and you hold a position, you do have to work with them. But where do you think it would lie should you get elected? if you'd like to continue.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. Nancy Pelosi has a reputation of being a master legislator, but her record since becoming Speaker in the current Congress reveals much more that she is a very eager capitulator. And I'll just make that clear across a range of fronts, and then I'll note how I differ. The very first thing that Speaker Pelosi did upon being chosen as the Speaker of the current House was to impose conservative fiscal austerity rules that Republicans demanded and Democrats resisted over the last 20 years. Her very first act was a concession to the pay-go rules, which basically represent a unilateral disarmament, a discriminatory set of accounting rules to inhibit progressive spending on social needs like affordable housing, like healthcare, and instead privilege government spending on abusive needs like military expenditures or contracts, right? The pay-go rules were just the first of several revelations of the Speaker's unfortunate co-optation by conservatism. Her continued commitment to protecting our criminal president from the overdue impeachment that he and his criminal administration deserve reflect another example of her unfortunate conservatism. Her denial of the aspirations that our country shares to secure healthcare as a matter of right. She has derided healthcare for all. She has ensured pharmaceutical and health insurance companies that they have nothing to fear from the Democratic majority. Let's go to climate justice and the economic justice issues that are driving the movement for a Green New Deal. Speaker Pelosi derides the Green New Deal as the Green New Dream, right? And that derision of a generation's aspirations, I think, is disqualifying, frankly, because at the very least, as a representative of our nation's most progressive city, she should be fighting for these principles. And that's exactly what I propose to do. Why I'm running is that I have fought for these principles my entire life as an immigrant, Muslim constitutional lawyer who's been very engaged in all of the social movements of the last 20 years that have confronted corporate power or our military industrial complex. I know what resistance means for real. I know what vision means and what activation means. I'm not afraid to use whatever position I have to establish more rights for the American people. And I'm very happy to fall on my sword. I think it's fair to say that I'm the first congressional candidate in the history of the Republic to have both been invited to brief members of Congress and their staffs on multiple occasions by multiple members, while also having been arrested in the US Senate for committing an act of journalism. And the fact that I've been willing to tolerate arrest to ask questions that no one else is asking, and that frankly, no one still has answered, reflects exactly my MO and exactly the style of representation that I aim to offer our pride city.
Agatha?
Yeah, I think this is a really important conversation in terms of, a lot of people think that just because you might have a Democrat as your representative, that things might be okay. But actually, if you just scratch beneath the surface just a little bit, you'll see that there are some major problems. So I think we need to get to a point where a corporate Democrat is unelectable. And Shahid mentioned many great points. I mean, if you just look at San Francisco is a bastion of progressive values. Noted, there is a strong conservative, powerful demographic here. But we should be the leader on climate action and on single payer healthcare. If you look at Pelosi's donor base, it would make sense why she is so dismissive and says the green dream or whatever. Because she gets hundreds of thousands of dollars from oil and gas, or her second largest donor are private insurance companies.
And Tom?
So I think the question was about to what degree Pelosi is similar to the Republicans and how does one cooperate or not cooperate?
Oh.
So if I'm right on that, I think on economic issues, most of the Democrats in Congress are similar to most of the Republicans. There's not a real break there on a lot of social issues. No, I don't think Nancy Pelosi is like most of the Democratic Party at all. I'm not going to go out and exaggerate and say she is wrong on everything because I disagree with her on some things. On the question of how does one cooperate with Republicans specifically and people one disagree with? I in the beginning, in my opening statement, I mentioned something I called a Marshall Plan for Central America. The idea being that we somehow find a way to make Central America livable. so that people wouldn't risk their lives to want to come here. And I think the reason I advocated is because I think we have a situation similar to what happened with the actual Marshall Plan after World War II, where people with very disparate interests might come together on a single program. And certainly those of us who feel for the people at the border and who feel that American foreign policy has abused those countries, we would want to do something to make that their countries livable. So would, on the other hand, people we don't share that much with, people who think it's extremely important to compete with the Chinese Silk Road initiative around the world. And not my first priority for what to do, but I know it sure beats competing with China by trying to develop a new fighter bomber or threatening them in the South China Sea. So there, I think, is the rare situation where cooperation among very disparate people might be a live possibility.
Could I add one point to that too?
Sure.
About the cooperation. So when I talk to folks who are fans of Pelosi and being here for so long, there's a lot of San Franciscans who believe Pelosi is my girl. And they say, they bring up her strength as in her ability to whip votes and to unify the Democratic vote in Congress. However, I think she's also such a lightning rod where even though we can get Democrats to pass things in the House, they just die in the Senate because Republicans refuse to work with her. So it's not good for any of us when the two sides can't work together at all.
I wouldn't mind adding just one piece there too, is as long as we're describing particularly opportunities for collaboration in Congress, even before the emergence of a progressive majority that would put us in a position to effectuate the platform that I think people are hearing, the three of us largely, at least with respect to broad stroke share, there are a set of issues on which there is a transpartisan majority in the grassroots that could easily find expression legislatively. They include the federal legalization of cannabis, which I describe both as a civil rights imperative, as well as a fiscal stimulus, especially for states like California that are poised to benefit from the emergence of interstate access to commerce and banking services, to a nascent industry that incidentally it's a carbon sequestering cash crop, right? So it's another example of beneficial intersectionality if we take advantage of this opportunity. Ending mass surveillance is a object of transpartisan consensus, even as creating a national security surveillance state has been an object of bipartisan consensus among careerist legislators in Washington. So dismantling the surveillance state, legalizing cannabis, dismantling mass incarceration is an object of transpartisan consensus that members of Congress could effectuate if they work together across the aisles. Another way of putting this is that should I prove so fortunate as to have the opportunity to represent San Francisco and Washington, I will be both more progressive and also at the same time less partisan than Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And maybe the last point I'd make here is that even when partisanship creates alignments that should encourage the Speaker to act, she still refuses to move. For instance, her partisan interest to impeach a criminal president aligns with the constitutional imperative, yet still in violation of the oath of office and even to her own partisan detriment and to the detriment of the party. Speaker Pelosi refuses to pursue executive accountability. These are just a few places where I think there are opportunities, like as Justin Amash's defection from the Republican Party demonstrates, to work across the aisle.
The next part we're going to do is Medicare for All. So, I've been asking my guests this for 300 shows for 2 years, but now ever since the last debate, I have to clarify what kind of Medicare for All do you support? So we'll kind of each address, do you support true Medicare for All where there is no private insurance, there is no for-profit, or just kind of what stipulations you have on it, and so forth. So if you'd like to continue.
Was that for me, Joy?
Yes.
Yeah, I absolutely support Medicare for All, the bill sponsored by Representative Pramila Jayapal. This is a single payer, preventive care, everything, soup to nuts. If you need to see a doctor, you need to see a nurse, you need medicine, you need to get a surgery, that's paid for from our tax dollars. And a couple of things to note here about Medicare for All that often get forgotten in the public discussion. The first is that we have the money for it. We spend more money on healthcare now than any industrialized country in the world, and we get worse healthcare for it. And it's particularly because so many Americans don't have access to preventive care. This is even the case for people who have insurance increasingly, especially as you get these sort of like high deductibles that create very strong disincentives to seek care when you need it, while still preventing theoretical coverage in the case of catastrophic events. By expanding access to preventive care, we can not only drive costs down across the system, but we can also achieve better health outcomes. Another way that will drive costs down through a Medicare for All system is by leveraging the government's formidable purchasing power as a consumer to drive down the price of inflated pharmaceuticals. It's a no-brainer. We should be doing that already. Even without a Medicare for All system, we could be leveraging government purchasing power to drive down the cost of drugs, but we don't do it because Congress has been more committed to inflating the profits of health insurance companies than members of Congress have been to the health of their own constituents. Eliminating administrative waste is another way here that Medicare for All will drive the cost down. Another thing that people forget, when we have Medicare for All in place, we will have overnight effectively taken the largest expense line off of the income statements of every major corporation in America, meaning that Medicare for All could be an incredibly powerful job stimulus. It could enable a wave of job creation across every industry in America. Finally, Medicare for All is going to have an incredibly helpful intersectional benefit with respect to homelessness, because when we were talking about, I know my allies in the race were describing the affordable housing crisis in the context of the homelessness crisis that is related to it. Homelessness certainly relates to, it stems from an inability of a city or a community to provide affordable housing. Homelessness is also, though, a very direct reflection of our for-profit healthcare system. The leading cause of both homelessness and bankruptcy are medical costs. And the idea that people have to fear going homeless just because they got sick is frankly barbaric. And that's one among many of the reasons why I'm committed to securing Medicare for All and establishing healthcare as a human right within the United States.
Tom?
So I've started knocking on doors in this race. And that has an obvious good effect on your cardiovascular system, et cetera, but it has, more importantly, a good effect on your political ear. You hear rank and file people who are not necessarily supporters of you at all, may really want you to go away. You hear a range of people, obviously, that you're doing it otherwise. So the words of the political programs we espouse become more important. We called our program initially a single payer in California, and the ballot question that I referred to, and it's always sort of described that way, at least in passing. But one of the things we ran up against was single payer. You know, it's jargon to most people. When we did that campaign 25 years ago, people would hear single parent. What's a single parent healthcare system, right? And so it was confusing to people. So over time, people drifted to Medicare for All because people understood that. Now, the problem we've got there, that we have to, I'm not faulting us for this, but it's just the hurdle we've got, is when people hear that, they hear the Medicare system that they know. Why would they not? They hear a system that is inadequate, that requires supplemental insurance. Now, and as much as Bernie Sanders and associates can argue in the debate, that comes for a minute, and people don't hear that much. So we have to figure out a way to get people to understand that we are talking about enhanced Medicare for all. All of the programs, indeed, that Shahid spoke of, yes, we know they're in the bills, and we know that the design is such that there would not be a need for supplemental policies, but that is not being heard out there. And that is people who I would not have expected to raise hackles with don't want to hear about Medicare for All because they don't think Medicare is good enough. They do want their private insurance now compared to what they understand Medicare to be. That's, like it or not, what we've got to deal with.
Right on. Next, we'll go to
Oh,
a federal jobs guarantee.
I
Hold on,
think you
I
might have
didn't get
skipped
it.
Agatha.
Forgot one, right?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
one more.
go for it.
Okay. I also absolutely believe we need Medicare for all and that we can afford it. This is a trend we see when we have when we don't have gender parity in Congress. We tend to find infinite funding for more masculine things like military or mass incarceration, and for more traditionally feminine things like nurturing our people, education, healthcare. Somehow we can afford it. We absolutely need this. And in San Francisco in particular, Shahid mentioned this, one of the biggest reasons people are experiencing homelessness is they can't afford a $400 medical bill. We also need to talk about single payer and how that enables collective bargaining. Part of the reasoning that we have such high expensive drug prices is because each district is doing their own negotiating. We don't have that power to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies. And last point I'll say is that, you know, some people I talk to, and especially around when we talk about Nancy Pelosi, they say, but she was the one that brought the ACA and we wouldn't have gotten this far if it was not for her. While I admit there are probably people alive today because of the ACA and because they were able to get insured, I would say the number one beneficiaries of the ACA are private insurance companies. It's a profit-driven model, and it's a middleman that doesn't even provide healthcare.
May I just chime in there just to agree, especially on that part about the beneficiaries of the ACA. One place I might push back is just on this characterization of spending as, you know, particularly masculine or feminine. And the only place it breaks down, like I'm an intersectional feminist, and I agree that, you know, a peaceful, more humane alternative to any of these policies is preferable. I would just note, however, that the speaker is a woman, and for better or worse, she's not promoting Medicare for all. She's not promoting climate justice. You know, she has been, as a leading woman in Congress, unfortunately, on the side of these predatory corporations that are part of the problem.
If I could also jump back in on one thing on the question of the ACA. I mean, I think we always have to be careful to be precise in our assessment of political programs. And what I mean is, the ACA is not the way I wanted to see it happen by any means. I've been a supporter for a single payer, as you know, for some time. Do I like the fact that it made insurance companies even more wealthy? I do not. But I also think I have to acknowledge that it was an advance. If more people get coverage, even if other people get rich off it who shouldn't, I have no choice but to prefer that to fewer people getting coverage. And I just point that out because I think we, you know, all of us in politics have a tendency to just denounce to the hilt anything we find less than what we want.
All right. I was just going to say, you know, I work in healthcare 40 hours a week, so you guys get it. Like, I'm always like, ooh, what are they going to say? You guys all get it. So my next question is about federal jobs guarantee. Do you support it? Why or why not? Agatha, since I skipped over you accidentally, you're going first.
Yeah, this is actually a topic that I need to know more about, and would actually like to hear from some of the other candidates. Yeah, could I hear a little bit and then maybe riff off of it?
Sure. Shahid?
Yeah, I'm very happy to embrace the federal jobs guarantee. It's a big part of the Green New Deal. And when we talk about the Green New Deal, people often reduce it to a robust set of solutions to the climate crisis. And it is that, but it's also a robust set of solutions to our country's economic crisis and the increasing untenability for working families to survive in high-cost urban areas, especially given the intersections we've talked about, you know, the untenable housing costs alongside our for-profit healthcare system. The federal jobs guarantee, one reason it's particularly meaningful is that it will enable a whole host of programs that otherwise would likely be very difficult to match. For instance, here in California, one of the predictable consequences of climate chaos has been our increasing propensity to wildfires that are already killing Californians. And, you know, we can't think about climate justice as a far off future need. It is an issue now already. And one of the things we need to do in California particularly is to restore indigenous forest management techniques, particularly clearing underbrush from otherwise fire-prone forests. That's something that happened for millennia until the genocide of Native Americans. And if we put a generation of people to work with living wage jobs to do high labor tasks like that, we can do things as a society that we don't have the capacity to do at the moment because our only mode of industrial organization is for profit. The federal jobs guarantee will unlock a litany of public service opportunities that might not be profitable in themselves, but they're very important investments to make in our communities. And those are just a few of the reasons why I'm very eager to support it and to see the rest of the Green New Deal both distilled from a vision into legislation and then secured as a matter of consensus.
Tom?
The idea of the government as employer of last resort, I absolutely support. This was part of legislation that Representative Ron Dellums, the late Representative Ron Dellums of Berkeley, used to sponsor every year. And by the way, one of the great people who served in Congress. There used to actually be a bit of a movement in San Francisco around this, which unfortunately just sort of faded away. I think opposition to something like this, one of those areas where you're talking earlier about what's the overlap between corporate Democrats and corporate Republicans. Opposition to something like this would unite them all because it's a threat to the capitalist system. And the capitalist system is supposed to be built on the mythical entrepreneurial qualities of billionaires to invest creatively. And again, I think, as has been discussed here in the consciousness around the Green New Deal, there's more and more recognition that there is nowhere else to go. If the government won't guarantee employment and the private sector cannot guarantee full employment, what is someone to do? There's no answer unless you give on that. And so absolutely, that again, it is true. It is contained in the Green New Deal. It's not foreground. The Green part is, of course, foreground. But it's absolutely something that this planet has to deal with, not just this.
Agatha, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure, yes, that I absolutely also, one of the exciting things about the Green New Deal is not just the environmental aspect, trying to bring our economy to a net zero carbon economy, but the economic part of it and the job transition part. And something that I would really like to see is for young people to get the opportunity to work for a year or two in a federal capacity or in a way where they get proximate and close to community, get to work in schools, where it's more encouraged that you don't just go from high school to college, but you actually get this kind of work experience. And perhaps through a federal jobs program, we could make that ubiquitous.
The next question will deal with immigration. Now, I know 2 of the 3 of you are immigrants, so this is going to be a really interesting part of the debate. Tom, you popped up on my screen. Would you like to start?
Immigration. Well, and by the way, I will note that I am actually an Irish citizen, though I am not an immigrant. How does that happen, you wonder? Because the Irish island was so thoroughly depopulated during the potato famine that citizenship is granted automatically if your parent or grandparent was born in Ireland. And my father, in fact, was the immigrant in question. So I guess I want to revert back to the notion I have of trying to make life livable in other parts of the world in a way that is not. The violence level in Central America, in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala is nothing that any of us would want to live with, although some people obviously do live with that in certain parts of this country. These are countries that in the past 10 years have each placed in the 10 most dangerous countries in the world. We have a long history there. We ought to be looking in that case where it is so close and there is a history to try to make immigration not be the option of first resort. Beyond that, of course, we are a country of immigrants. We ought to always remember that, and also, of course, remember that at the same time, most of the people who are the we who talk about this are descendants of people or related to people who took this country from someone else in the first place. So a great deal of modesty, humility should come over in this. We should always be generous on this front.
Agatha?
Right. This topic, immigration, is the one that is most emotional for me, both from personal experience and in being an advocate. So one story from my childhood is that I grew up with a next door neighbor who, she and I had the same life on paper, but our outcomes in life were dramatically different. So we were both born in Brazil. We both came to the US as kids, lived on the same block, same public schools. But when it came time to apply for college, that's when I found out that she was undocumented this whole time. And this was before DACA. So I got to go to, we both performed the same academically, and I got to go to Stanford, and she was held back. And so many of my peers in high school did too. So I think we need to expand opportunities, not just have an executive order like DACA, but we need a pathway to citizenship for all 11 million undocumented immigrants and TPS holders. In addition, I've spent a lot of time at the border and in immigrant detention, and not just recently with family separation, but for years. And even have worked in Central America and followed the migrant journey. And it's really, it's traumatizing what goes on. I think one of the most violent things about our policymaking is this policy of deterrence, that we should, if an immigrant crosses our border without documentation, that we should make their experience as awful as possible so as to prevent other people from coming. So when we cross the border, we put someone for 3 days in an ICE cell called a hielera, and then we detain them in these remote places where it's so difficult to get legal representation. There's not enough immigration judges. And we know that immigrant detention is the most profitable part of mass incarceration, and actually has worse outcomes. We could be a country that follows international asylum law, and that has more community-based asylum practices. We also need to update technology. I find it ridiculous that when people then do get released from detention, typically on an ankle monitor, they're given a stack of papers, all in English, and their court date is sent via postcard. And you have 9 days to show up. When you don't live here, you don't have an address. And I totally agree with Tom. I've been to Central America. I've talked to so many families. I've been to a childhood morgue where there is a warehouse of coffins that are this short, like the size of children, mostly because of gang violence. And it's just despicable. And the US's influence in that needs to be addressed as a root cause issue to quell the mass migration that is happening to the US. But we should still be open to immigrants, of course.
And Shahid?
Thanks, Joy. Just so I can grip it, I know that immigration is the subject. Is there a particular question? I can go in a lot of directions here. I just want to be responsive to your interest.
I'm sorry, it cut out.
I know that immigration was the subject. I just wanted to grip the question better because I can go in a lot of different directions with respect to immigration.
Well, essentially, what is your biggest focus? What is your focal point?
So with respect to immigration, my biggest focus is ensuring that immigrants aren't used as political punching bags to induce the rest of the country to embrace an interior surveillance net of the sort that, frankly, corporate Democrats have already approved. A lot of Americans aren't familiar with the FBI's Next Generation Initiative, and it's a biometric database, a surveillance database, that was initially launched and presented to the public as an immigrant deportation scheme under the Obama administration, known as the Secure Communities Initiative. Throughout the time that it was presented to the public as an immigration scheme, the Next Generation Initiative was actually a domestic surveillance program, but it used immigrants as the bait to get the country to accept a program that we never would have accepted in the first place. And there's a theme here. I had an opportunity to visit the border near San Diego about a month ago, and I visited with some folks at a human rights organization, Al Otro Lado, and they described to me a set of circumstances that Amnesty International has documented in a report called Defending Human Rights is Not a Crime. And it goes something like this. We might, what I was describing just now was the fear of the experience that immigrants are subjected to discriminatorily, then becoming the leading edge for expanding abuses. At the southern border already, Trump's border wall in the places where it exists, because Speaker Pelosi has given it $4.6 billion, right, to facilitate the border abuses that his administration has become infamous for. At the border currently, US citizens are being denied permission to leave if they're on a government watch list of human rights advocates. And this idea that the wall is there to keep people out flies in the face of that reality. This has already become a wall being used to keep Americans in, and this migration of, and I guess that's a pun intended, the migration of burdens from migrants to the rest of America is one that I think people overlook at our own peril. The fascism that we are combating ultimately is demonstrated in sharpest display at the border, where, just to be clear, our government doesn't have any legal right to detain asylees, let alone en masse. Just like our government has no right to deny US citizens egress, just like our government has no right to discriminate according to Americans, according to our political viewpoints. And it's especially perverted when the viewpoint that is suppressed is the defense of international human rights commitments that we fought a world war to establish in the first place. My family moved twice around the world to be free, first from Pakistan to England, and then from the UK to the US. And I think it is remarkably ironic, and I take a great deal of pride as an immigrant constitutional lawyer in being called, frankly, to remind so many of my neighbors and other Americans what our own country's stated values and commitments are. And I think that in a time like this, when our communities are demonized and vilified, is an opportunity for us to demonstrate and model precisely what it means to be American. And I would just go back, to the marriage equality case that I filed 15 years ago. To be American is to fight for the rights of your neighbors. And that's exactly why I'm very proud to be a citizen of this great country.
All right, so on that note, we're gonna digress a little bit into for-profit prisons, which is comparable. That is something a lot of Californian candidates also discuss with me. What, A, do you support them? I think we know the answer, but also B, how do we get rid of them? Yes. So if you want to continue.
Yeah, happy to. The for-profit prisons and policing are an example of inherent corruption. And I'll go back to US president for the basis for this. When President Dwight Eisenhower warned the American people, it was January 1961, that a military industrial complex would threaten our democracy and our rights, he didn't say the words, but what he was ultimately talking about was also a policing industrial complex. And at root, what his warning presaged was the observation that anytime we allow the profit motive to monetize the human's quest for security, the human need for security, we will do things that make no sense. Now, in the context of mass incarceration, what we have created is an industrialized slavery model that is layers worse than the ones that preceded it. There are more African-American men in prison today, subjected to legal slavery under the terms of the 13th Amendment, that there were in bondage at the height of the antebellum South. And prison labor is used for any number of industries. For-profit prisons are, and maybe I'll just take this another step back. Not only is we talked about prisons, but policing is another example of a for-profit co-optation of this human need for security. Chicago is a good example where the police department there was found to be using civil asset forfeiture to then reinvest in surveillance tools to then find new assets to seize. And it's just a straight forward corruption loop. And that's exactly what we should recognize when we look at for-profit policing or prisons or immigrant detention. The profit motive should have no role in any of these functions. And these should be government functions precisely because once we let companies get their hands on it, they make decisions that are to everyone's, that are to no one's benefit. There's one point I want to make here further. When we talk about dismantling mass incarceration, incidentally, my campaign has a 30-point platform. It's expansive, it's visionary. It is the most robust and rigorous remix that I've seen of the demands of the movement for Black lives and the movement for immigrant rights. It's the fact that we put it together, I think, is one of the reasons why Sean King has endorsed us, the very prolific journalist and activist in the movement for Black lives. When we talk about dismantling mass incarceration, we have to talk about accountability of the CIA. And this is a bit of a bug in my bonnet. You know, a big part of the reason I'm running for Congress is to do the work to challenge the intelligence agencies that have been shredding the Constitution for the last 50 years, if not longer, in this country. And the CIA in particular, people appropriately blame the agency for torturing detainees or vaporizing US citizens and their children based on speech crimes. But people forget that the CIA also ran drugs into LA and Miami in the 90s. The CIA is responsible for mass incarceration. There's a book by Gary Webb, Dark Alliance. I would recommend that anybody read it who hasn't before. He's an investigative journalist from here in the Bay Area who died of a suicide entailing 2 gunshot wounds to the head. And I would just invite anyone to square those facts for me. But what he uncovered was that the CIA was running drugs into the US to fund its rogue foreign policy. A generation of Americans have ended up in prison as a result. There's never been any accountability for the real criminals there who remain very much at large and at liberty to do whatever they're going to do next to contrive travesties en masse in plain sight. So thanks for the question. I'm very committed to dismantling mass incarceration.
Awesome. And for whatever reason, Sean King, if you're watching, I love you and thank you for following me. You're awesome and you're welcome to come here anytime. Okay, next I'm going to send it to Agatha.
We do not live in a healthy democracy based on our criminal justice system. I agree with Shahid. Our country was founded on genocide and slavery, and mass incarceration today is just an evolution of subjugating people of color and presuming people of color as dangerous. One of the unfortunate things I think about locked facilities is that they're often in it's where we put away bad people without addressing the root cause of why a crime was able to be committed in the first place. When I look at someone who has been incarcerated, I don't see them as a bad person. I see it as a failing on us as a society. I worked with a program in Chicago to reduce gun violence that worked with formerly incarcerated young men and those most likely to shoot or be shot. And you ask almost any of them, what would have prevented you from selling drugs or getting involved in gangs? And it's so simple. Like, so most of them say, a job that maybe would have paid me $15 an hour. I mean, the fact that we will incarcerate someone and pay $100,000 to lock them up and to take them away from their families, take away a breadwinner from a family, when the alternative, like employing them in the legal economy, would have been so much better. I think we need to move to a system that is much smaller, less punitive, and that has true metrics of success. How are we trying to rehabilitate people? We can also, one of my favorite pieces of content I would recommend people watching is Anna Deavere Smith's School to Prison Pipeline. She did a play and now it's a documentary on HBO. And so looking at how most schools in America have more armed law enforcement officers than counselors or social workers. And that pipeline from school to prison needs to be cut off pronto.
Tom?
I think the question was for-profit prisons. I am, as you guessed, am against them like the others. One thing I think should be noted about them is...
Excuse me.
You startled me there. I wasn't sure something I said.
Sorry, guys.
Okay. In a sense, the development of for-profit prisons are a reflection, you might say, of the crisis of capital. What I mean by this is when private corporations run out of ways to make money in the private economy, what they've gotten into now, it's gone decades back, is what part of the government can they eat? What part of what business can they get into where there's a guaranteed revenue stream? Where you don't have to compete with somebody else. You don't have to convince somebody they need it. Prisons have been one of them. The other one, really probably the larger, or possibly at any rate, is education, which we haven't discussed at all tonight, the for-profit charter school. Sticking back to the prisons, it should be an absolute principle that there's not an incentive for building more prisons because somebody makes money out of it. We can discuss the nature of prisons, how many there should be, and have varying opinions, but no one should profit from growth in prison. That should just be off the table. And we should, in terms of how do we get rid of them, I think we have to demonstrate every single instance where that's the case, where the prison did not need to exist, but there was profit in making it exist. And if it existed, of course it had to be.
And we were actually going to go to education next. So now you said you wanted to talk about charter schools. Totally cool. I was going to go with free college tuition.
I know.
Absolutely. Take it away, Tom.
you froze there.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so tell me what you said before you froze.
Oh, I was saying that I was going to go with free college tuition, and even pre-K, free pre-K. But you said you wanted to address charter schools, so if you want to go that route, you certainly may.
Let me go broader than that. I want to mention that we hadn't discussed education at all, and what I want to suggest is that we should be looking at full federal funding of education. Extremely difficult program to pull off, but here's why we should think about it, in my mind. The federal government funds a pretty small percentage, under 10%, I believe, of all education. It's mostly state and local funding. And the local funding is based on property tax. It is based upon the wealth in a town. States sometimes have formulas to equalize the unequal wealth and therefore unequal schools of different cities and towns. There is one way to have a solution to this, is if the federal government funded equally, we would have a great deal, we would have all of our problems of the local inequities of wealth washed away. Now, as I said, I don't for a minute think this is an easy program. The idea of the federal government controlling education is anathema to a lot of people, in some respects, perhaps for good reasons, as to the fear of central control of a curriculum, but in other cases, I think for not good reasons at all. People want their town to be able to be a place that has better schools than others. So, but that is a proposal that I think that needs to be brought forth into general discussion.
Shahid?
So I definitely support public education institutions and think that charter schools represent a threat to the funding pipeline for K through 12 schools. I wouldn't necessarily support the federalization of education only because I think that the responsiveness of school boards to their respective communities is very important. And an important locus of localism, an example of communities having an opportunity to determine the contours of how their shared resources are deployed. So, but just thinking about the debt-free college piece in particular, just to start there, my college education was very atypical. I worked for 10 years for a series of banks, of all things, in Chicago while I went to night school for my undergrad degree. And the reason I was invited to study and then ultimately teach law at Stanford was because I wrote an undergrad thesis exploring basically how we could effectively redistribute wealth within the context of a market economy. That was the basis for my first law review article back in 2000. Debt-free college, an affordable college, would have given me the opportunity to go straight through and frankly to have an opportunity to focus on the objects of my learning that instead were deferred for 10 years while I was basically a servant to capital just to survive in Chicago. This was my experience in the 90s. And for me, not being able to go to college as a young person, I graduated from high school at 16, right as my family was losing our house in suburban St. Louis. I show up at the University of Chicago. I did really well in high school. I had not a dollar to my name. And within a year, I was basically on the street. And that's an experience that too many young people have to endure. For me, ultimately, looking back, it was a great experience for me. It was a character building experience. It taught me a work ethic. I don't think anyone else should have to go through it. And I think that making college accessible to people of all economic strata is a vital, not just avenue for their opportunity, but a vital measure to make sure that our society is allowing people to gain access to the spaces where they can be most helpful, right? The idea that the cure for cancer is languishing in a prison somewhere because they didn't have an opportunity to get the job, for instance, that Agatha was mentioning, and instead they might get forced into a very different life. That's exactly the kind of public harm that public education is supposed to prevent. And as long as we have already established K through 12 education as not a matter of right, because the Supreme Court has rejected characterizing it as a fundamental right, at least, but it's one that we acknowledge as a society that we provide to everyone. We should extend that so that people have an opportunity to learn from pre-K through graduate school to the limit of their interest and what they're able to through their merit and study gain access to. Cost should not be a barrier to the opportunity to learn.
Mm-hmm. And Agatha.
Yeah, I believe that pre-K and college should be free and accessible to all. We would be a very different country if we invested in education on that scale. I am a product of the public education system, and the only reason I was able to go to Stanford is because I got a 90% financial aid scholarship to do so. Funny enough, the public school that I grew up in was had a collaboration with the German government. It was a foreign language program. And at the end of it, it made it easier for you to apply to German universities. And it was guaranteed free. As a foreigner, I would get to go to university in Germany for free, way cheaper than in my own country, which is ridiculous. I think the funding models of public schools needs to change away from being based on property taxes. It shouldn't be based on your neighborhood or the affluence of your homes. It should be more universal and equal across the board.
Okay, let me see. So one of the things that Pelosi is known for is PAYGO. She's called Pelosi. Would you have voted for that? We could start with you. No?
No.
Can you expand?
No, just no.
Just no? Okay. Tom?
No, as well. It's a tactic to reduce spending on basically on social needs. Do we have PAYGO for our latest missile system? Don't think so.
Shahid?
Yeah, Tom nailed it there. The PAYGO rules are a discriminatory accounting tactic to disarm progressive spending in service of the needs of the American people while preserving access to funds for the corrupt military industrial complex to siphon our resources, our collective resources, into profit-making enterprises. The PAYGO rules in particular, they came up earlier in the debate. I describe them as revealing Speaker Pelosi's co-optation at the outset. On the one hand, I do recognize and I applaud the era in her career when she showed up for liberal values. I applaud her work securing funding for AIDS research in the 90s. But to see her very first act as the Speaker of the current Congress to unilaterally impose Republican demands for how Congress would account for the money that it spends is preposterous. Just to explain it maybe for your viewers for whom we didn't unpack it, the PAYGO rules require that when Congress passes spending programs for human needs, at the same time, to create the budget space for those programs, we have to either increase taxes or cut other programs. And that's exactly the kind of requirement that is not applied to, for instance, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, or the next aircraft carrier group, or the next nuclear weapons system, or whatever else the corrupt Washington cabal wants to waste our money on. It is one thing to say that Speaker Pelosi might be ineffective in the role of resisting the administration. The PAYGO rules in particular suggest that it is worse than that the problem is not ineffectiveness, but rather co-optation. And I would say that the PAYGO rules as a moment in time were a very early alarm for me about what Speaker Pelosi's tenure in office with the gavel in this term would be like. And I hate to say I told you so, and in this case, I hate to be proven right. But it was a very disappointing early reflection of the mode that has continued to characterize her time with the gavel.
So the next topic we're going to do is I received questions from the viewers, and I picked out one for each of you. Shahid, since you're up, I've heard this concern from several people. You speak on impeachment frequently. People wanted to know if you feel it distracts from the other issues and why we wouldn't just keep fighting to vote Trump out instead of fighting for impeachment while we're in a presidential primaries.
Right. So I'm a constitutional lawyer, which is to say I look at politics through a longer lens than just the electoral cycle. And one of the lenses that we're encouraged in constitutional law to consider is the balance of power among the branches of government. It's one reason why I describe impeaching our criminal president as a constitutional imperative. Another way to put this is that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. There is nothing that prevents us from articulating and proposing and advocating for a visionary agenda that meets the needs of the American people, including Medicare for all and the Green New Deal, while at the same time pursuing executive accountability for crimes that have already been committed. And I would, with respect to impeachment, hang the hat on the emoluments clause. Our criminal president demonstrates his corruption more or less on a daily basis. His impeachable acts include incitements to violence. They include lying to the public and policymakers on a daily basis. They include self-enrichment at taxpayer expense. Every time the president takes a Secret Service detail to one of his resorts, we collectively, the people of the United States, are being fleeced. And that's enough of a reason to impeach someone, period. Now, Speaker Pelosi has a partisan calculus. She thinks that if we don't impeach, it will improve the Democrats' partisan hand in the 2020 elections. And in the first instance, I would just say that is an illegitimate criterion, because the constitutional imperative of impeachment, which is implicit, incidentally, in the oath of office to which every member of Congress swears, an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And the greatest threat to our Constitution, undeniably, is our criminal president. So Speaker Pelosi would rather put the partisan interest first, saying that the electoral interests in 2020 are more important. First, I would say that's wrong in terms of its prioritization. It's also wrong in terms of her assessment, because seeking the impeachment of the president is a political winner for at least two reasons. The first is that it will put his serial crimes against the Republic on display. The second reason, and this is the crux, Speaker Pelosi's reticence to let the impeachment train leave the station in the House because she thinks it can't reach the station in the Senate does a profound disrespect, particularly to Democratic and progressive party activists in states represented by red senators who are up for re-election. There are something on the order of a dozen Republican senators who are up for re-election in 2020. And the idea that if forced to choose between the president's future and their own, that none of them would break to pursue their own self-interest, frankly, flies in the face of political reality. Another way to put that is that the reticence to pursue impeachment both violates the oath of office, it gives away the electoral game, and it invites any amount of future criminality. As much as I want to see Democrats win in 2020, I know the way that we win in 2020 is simply by nominating Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders beats Trump. He would have beat him in 2016. That's why a lot of us supported him then. I know Bernie Sanders will beat him in 2020. We don't have to take constitutional imperatives off the table because Speaker Pelosi is so risk averse that she can't understand how to win an election against a criminal kleptocrat, without it. And I think at the end of the day, we need to pursue impeachment. We absolutely can also pursue a visionary agenda at the same time. The fact that corporate Democrats have seen fit to do neither is exactly why they need to be replaced, and why I look forward to representing San Francisco and Washington after 2020.
Okay, that was okay. So the next question I have is, Agatha, two people asked me this one. You are connected to an organization called Emerson Collective, and throughout research, they found that it was started by Steve Jobs' widow, and her managing partner is a union-busting charter school advocate. I'm sorry?
I haven't said anything.
Oh, okay. And let me see what else I wrote down. They had a plan to expand and improve border detention centers. That was 3 years ago.
No. So for background, I did work at Emerson Collective for 4.5 years. I started when there were just 12 people, and then it grew to 220 people. And I recently left that job to run for Congress full time. So I was there in this supposed 3-year thing where we tried to increase border detention, and that's absolutely not the case. I would say that Emerson Collective is the most progressive advocate for undocumented immigrants and asylum seekers in the United States, and the partners that we work with would never endorse that. And I don't understand. I visited immigrant detention so many times to expose what was going on there and to put an end to it. And I remember being in a room when family detention started to happen before even the ACLU filed a case against it. And we were trying to come up with ways to get the public riled up about it and to take action. So I would disagree with that. And I think I got an amazing education working at Emerson Collective. The fact that I was able to spend so much time in classrooms, in these block facilities, in immigrant detention, working with undocumented folks, working on gun violence with some of the greatest nonprofits and social justice advocates in the country, it's why I was inspired to run, because I got to see that firsthand.
And do you have a response about her partner being pro-charter school and union busting?
Yeah, so I'm not 100% familiar with Arne Duncan. He's the former Secretary of Education under Obama. I admire him and admired his leadership. I'm not so sure about his history on unions. I know Emerson does support some charter schools, but we're very specific about which charter schools we support. It's nonprofit charter schools that have open admission, that's fair, and tries to close the gap in equity and tries to inspire the public education system to be more innovative or to address needs that are not met. For example, we did support a charter school in Los Angeles that solely works with foster youth, that has different sites across the city and has mobile campuses to reach students where they are at. There's also another environmental charter school in Louisiana that's on a barge where it's all about climate justice. So very specific, narrow kind of charter school.
Okay, and then the question I got for Tom is, being that you are relatively unknown, I don't want that to come out mean, but since you are relatively unknown, do you think you can win this, and are you fighting to win this?
Okay, so I'll start with something I would have said in closing, which is to thank you for putting on this event. Because to a certain extent, the campaign is beginning for me right about now. In the sense I referred in passing to the fact that I was committed to not throwing lots of money at this race. It seemed to me when $225,000 was spent fruitlessly last time, plunging into maximal fundraising seemed exactly the wrong thing to do. It's sort of, it's an economist would tell you it's akin to the example of the anarchy of the production of capitalist system. What do I mean by that? That for each company, it is perfectly sensible for them to charge as much as they can, sell as much as they can, pay their employees as little as they can. For the system as a whole, it's a disaster because you now have people who can't actually buy the things that were made. What's the analogy I'm making here? For the progressive movement in San Francisco, with the example of what happened last year, it is perfectly sensible for each campaign internally to raise as much as they can. It makes little, if any, sense for the progressive movement to have any number of campaigns raising that kind of money when they are running against other candidates to the left. And that money could have gone to other causes, the money that winds up being spent fruitlessly. So I started out thinking, what's the way I could do this stage as cheaply as possible, and came up with the idea that I should simply limit expenditure, contributions accepted. I have proposed that there be a runoff, an internal progressive primary, as I've said. There's about 20% that we start out with in this race, the left. That's what they got about last time. Any one of the three of us, and probably others who may enter later, would take that 20% if there were just the one of us. And the question is, can anybody get past that? And this really gets into what I would be saying as a wrap-up. My belief is that I have the best ability in the field. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think that I had the ability to speak to beyond the 20% that we've already got. So a long way of saying that I understand the difficulties that I have set up for myself in this race, but do it because I think I am the candidate who can take us to 30, 40% better than others.
Okay. And then I'll kind of rephrase that because you kind of answered my next question. The biggest concern, and I'm sure because you guys have been tagged in the posts I've been making, people's biggest concern is the progressive vote being split. That is absolutely the concern. You guys know this. So, it was very important to them that I asked, are you staying in this to the end? Is there, at some point, are you going to be willing to join forces and rally around someone so we can get, one person to hopefully take on Pelosi? Or where are your heads as far as that goes? Agatha, do you want to take that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do hear this all the time. And I would say that I'm not a closed-minded or a stubborn person. And I do think this race is so important that I would consider options as long as I felt that it would strengthen us and it was done in a fair way. Compared to last cycle, last cycle, there was never, if I remember correctly, there was never a debate, never a town hall with all the progressive challengers for people to see the different candidates. So I think this is historic. Thank you so much. And I think we should do more of this. I also see we could be doing a World Cafe type forum or fishbowl where, different town hall events that really get San Franciscans thinking about this election in a new way, because I think it can be easy to check out or assume our support lies solely with the progressive base. We won't win an election with just progressives in San Francisco. We need to expand beyond that.
And Shahid?
So I'll try to do this and at the same time maybe respond to a few of the points that Tom made. My goal is not to get 30 or 40%. My goal in this race is to get over 50% and liberate this seat. I'm very confident we can do it, if only because when I contrast our campaign with our 2018 race, we're in a world of difference. In 2018, I got more votes than anybody challenging Nancy Pelosi in a primary from the left than anyone in a decade. I did that in 3 months without any media attention. The first lesson that I learned in comparing our results to other campaigns that ran alongside ours was to get in the race earlier. And that's one reason why our campaigns hit the ground before any other campaigns in this cycle. It's one reason we have 4,000 donors from around the country in every state. It's one reason we have hundreds of volunteers. There were 2 mobilizations today before coming to join you here today. We had volunteers out at a farmer's market in Noe Valley. I was part of an action at the ferry building to defend human rights that are threatened in Kashmir. We have daily mobilizations. And I think the reason why we're seeing that kind of uptick in support is precisely because the city is already committed, I think, not to dividing its forces. I led the progressive field in the last race, despite being the last candidate to enter and having the first campaign to be mobilized on the ground. We have city, signs up across the city. We've gotten endorsed by Sean King, by Linda Sarsour, by our former president of our board of supervisors, Matt Gonzalez, another former member of the board, Eric Marr, have been endorsed by Vets for Bernie, by Bay Area for Bernie. I'm confident those endorsements will expand to include at least the majority of the progressive clubs in the city. And that's why we're going to liberate the seat. Tom has an interest in a progressive primary. And I would say that if the goal is to prevent fracturing of the progressive movement in San Francisco, that does present some tension simply with his candidacy. And I'm not here to punch down or to say anything negative about my allies in the race. I welcome anybody who has concerns about the corporate co-optation of the Democratic Party to raise their voice. I would note that we don't have instant runoff voting as we do for municipal elections in San Francisco for federal offices, which is to say, it is likely that only one of us will be in a position to challenge the speaker. I think that my record of work advancing the progressive movement, I think the breadth of support that we've already attracted, the press coverage that we've already gained, the outlets that have done long form profiles of our campaign include Jacobin, Mother Jones, Jewish Currents, Salon. We've been quoted by the New York Times and the Washington Post and The Hill. These kinds of opportunities to frame the debate already, even before having the seat, I think reflect our ability as a campaign, I dare say uniquely in the field, to challenge the speaker, not just for the seat, but discursively for the ideas in the meantime. And frankly, as much as I am running a campaign to win an election in November 2020, we have a year between now and then, and I'm fighting for the discourse every day of the week. And that's not because I believe in my voice, but because there are thousands of people who believe in our voice. Just about a year ago, 17,500 San Franciscans selected me to be Nancy Pelosi's replacement. I'm looking forward to increasing that number by an order of magnitude in March in the primary and scaling it again before the November election and giving my neighbors a chance to have a voice in Washington that's aligned with their values instead of opposed to them.
May I say something?
Sure.
Yeah, Shahid discusses his candidacy last year as if it were a triumph, a personal triumph. He defeated the other 2 candidates of the left. Unfortunately, as we know, his 8.5% was less than the 9.08% that the Republican got. And what we should understand, Shahid entered this race very late, the last week, I believe. If I'm wrong on that detail, he'll correct me. When he entered the race, there was already a candidate in it who had the endorsement of Brand New Congress, the organization made famous by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's win. There was another candidate who had the endorsement of the San Francisco Bernie. But for whatever his reasons were, he decided he needed to enter at that late point. It is hard for me not to conclude that that late entry is precisely what caused the Republican to be able to win. Why do I say that? Because if 50%, if Shahid's vote was split 50-50, one of the other candidates would have made the final. In fact, if as few as 38% of his voters went to the candidate behind him, that one would have made the runoff. What happened the last time
why
was
would you
not
invert
a
the
triumph
calculus and
for
presume
anybody.
that my voters would go to someone who got fewer votes than me? It just seems odd that you would suggest that the candidates who didn't have the same support I did should have gotten the support that I got.
There were people looking for candidates of the left. I think it is quite likely that if you had not been in the race, they would have gone to one of the other two candidates. I cannot prove it, obviously. It's a counterfactual. People will draw their own conclusions, but the numbers I have cited,
It's counterfactual because I did beat all of those campaigns by a mile. I mean, the closest among them to me was in the race for 4 times as long as we were. They outspent us by 30%, and I beat their vote total by 50%.
Right. And I think they, however, would have had enough votes to beat the Republican absent you.
It may have been true, but the earliest supporters of that campaign recruited me because everyone who supported that campaign developed buyer's remorse over the course of it. And I'm not here to relitigate 2018. I mean, I emerged from it as the leading progressive. The reason I got in the race, since Tom seems to be raising it, is because I was asked to enter the race by people who had previously supported one of the candidates he's describing, who's now supporting Agatha. But you know, the fact that I ended the aspirations of a political figure in San Francisco is, I mean, I frankly don't care. I mean, I'm here to represent the city. The egos of other people in this who have aspirations are not my concern. My concerns are human rights. My concerns are advancing the movement for democratic socialism. My concerns are advancing democracy and defending my community from an onslaught by police and intelligence agencies that our city's representative in Washington has been all too friendly towards. And ultimately, you know, the fact that there were other campaigns in the race that were clearly not prepared to contend for the general election. These were campaigns, frankly, that were poised to co-opt Bernie's brand, campaigns that weren't necessarily intersectional. Maybe I'll just say that. I ran the only campaign in 2018 that was intersectionally committed to justice. And the reason I got in the race is that there wasn't a campaign doing that before me with any degree of credibility or preparation. And I'll go back to something I shared before. I'm not here because I have political aspirations. I'm here because my political frustrations eclipsed my interest in self-preservation. And it just so happens that between having taught at Stanford Law School, between having run a national nonprofit, between having helped launch a movement for marriage equality through impact litigation and worked in the policy sphere, I'm just more prepared to do the job for better or worse than anyone else in the race. And I think that's why we have thousands of supporters and a growing expanse of endorsers supporting our race.
Did the people who asked you to run consider it a triumph when a Republican made the final?
You might have to ask them, Tom. I think you might be asking the wrong person.
So, okay, so great discussion because that was going to be one of my questions. So thank you, Tom. What segues into that is,
Joy, can I just ask how long we're going to be going? Because we've been going for over 2 hours at this point. My impression was we were supposed to be finished about 45 minutes ago. Do you plan for this to go on much longer?
I was actually going to ask one more question and then closing statements.
Great.
So my last question then would be, as far as voting, we are going through a lot of defeatism, a lot of, just, does my vote even count? Should I vote? What's the point? And I'm sure you guys come across that with your district. When you do, what is something you say to them? How do you encourage them? How do you encourage people to say, no, still vote, still get involved, volunteer? Shahid, you're up here, you're on the screen. Do you want to just take that?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, I might press back on parts of the premise. I don't get that a lot. I mean, our response as we're in the city, it tends to be one of pretty unrestrained enthusiasm. You know, I can't walk outside my house now in most of San Francisco without somebody stopping me and saying, you know, beat Pelosi, or, like, go get him. And I can't ride the bus. I can't go for a run without someone stopping me. And it's not, none of those people, at least those people, need to be convinced. And as we meet people in the Democratic clubs, as we meet people in social movements, as we meet people through canvassing, we've gotten a very enthusiastic reception. In fact, the response I've tended to get is, thank God, we need someone to replace her. And I think that I give a great deal of credit and respect to the predecessors who before me have run in other cycles. Preston Pickus, who was Nancy Pelosi's general election challenger in 2016, he's also endorsed me. And Cindy Sheehan and the other challengers who come before. I recognize that I stand on very tall shoulders. And I also recognize that among those voices, people have done a lot of very inspiring and important things. It just so happens that those voices typically have not had the opportunities to do the kinds of things that I've done. And it's, again, one reason why I'm looking forward to liberating the seat. It's one reason why I think the reception to our campaign tends to be one that is more enthusiastic than skeptical. The skepticism that emerges for us is more about, like, can you actually win? It's not so much as does my vote matter, it's can you knock off the hardest target in the House? She raises more money than anybody in the House, and can a propertyless immigrant whose only qualification is a great deal of preparation and 20 years of receipts fighting for the movement, can I knock off the chief corporate fundraiser in the House? The reason why I'm confident we're going to do it is not because I have any inflated sense of the value of my own voice. It's because I recognize we're living through a generational transition. And that while many of the newcomers to San Francisco might be upwardly mobile, many of them work in tech, many of those people also recognize that no amount of economic privilege can insulate them from the already here and mounting impacts of the climate catastrophe. And I see a lot of new voters and a lot of older voters in San Francisco breaking for us, seeing in our voice an alternative to bipartisan corporate rule.
Agatha?
All right, I disagree on this point. I have a very different experience. One of us is living in a bubble. Okay, so young people are one of the biggest demographics in San Francisco. I have a weekly dinner where we talk about the campaign, and the rule is that 15 new people have to show up. And so many people I talk to, it is an education. It is a long conversation to explain to people why Pelosi needs to be challenged. I would say the vast majority of my peers cannot tell you the difference between ACA, Medicare, single payer, Obamacare. It's true that among our progressive peers, people are riled up, they are woke, they are paying attention to the news, they are vocal on Twitter. I would say the vast majority of San Franciscans, there is an uphill battle. And last year when I worked on a month of voter registration with all these local organizing groups, I had this conversation so many times, encouraging people, asking them, why didn't you vote before? Why are you registering now for the first time? And I've had so many conversations here in San Francisco, people who can be highly educated or work at these shining tech companies, but are in the closet. And, they'll sheepishly come to me and say, okay, I wasn't going to tell you this, but I didn't vote in the last election, or I've never registered to vote in San Francisco. I felt like, my vote in California as a Democrat wouldn't have mattered on the presidential level. And then down ballot, it was just so overwhelming. I didn't know what sources of information to trust. It just seemed overwhelming. I've talked to someone else who was so gung-ho about my campaign. His interests were that I represented tech, and I had a savviness about that he hadn't seen before. And willing to donate to my campaign and wanted to support. And then I asked you, are you registered to vote? And he's like, no, I could debate you on this for hours. Like, I've already made the decision that I don't vote, but I pressured him and I had that conversation. And by the end of it, he changed his mind and registered to vote because he felt like I was the first person that made him feel like his vote mattered, and that someone like him believes in government so much that they're willing to change their life and do something about it and be a voice for our generation.
Right on. Tom?
The question was, how do you get people not to give up? Is that it?
Right, when they're feeling defeated.
Yeah.
How do you tell them, get off your ass? get to the polls.
Yeah. I'm not going to take a long time to give you an answer. I don't think there's any sophisticated answer to give. Try and tell them, point out to an election that mattered or some activity that's not an election. Give them something to do.
All right. So we will give you each 3-minute closing comments. Tom, since you're on the screen, take it away.
All right. I mentioned earlier that I considered myself a member of the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party since before there was one. There's a very obscure book called Radicals in Power, which is quite an exaggeration in the title right there, that discusses the period, has a chapter on Bernie Sanders as mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and a chapter is on me as a Democratic Socialist representative in the Massachusetts legislature. So it wasn't Bernie's wing at that point, but I was in it. Why I think that is important, as I mentioned earlier, we've got 20% that will be with us, let's say. There's no way to be precise about this, but looking at the last election, about 20% will oppose Pelosi from the left, 10% will oppose her from the right. And the question is getting to a higher number, whether that number stops at 35, whether that number, as we would love it to, goes to 51%. I have done this. I have held public office. I have dealt with the legislative process. I have dealt with people I can't agree with. I have dealt with voters who were not fundamentally interested in the issues I was interested in, but nonetheless had to be brought in to a coalition. When it comes to getting past the 20%, as I indicated, I thought before, I think that no one in this race has the experience of talking plain talk to the American people that I have. As I say, I am outdoors at this point. It sharpens the ear. One learns what does matter to people apart from what we know should matter to people. So that is why I'm in this. If I didn't think I could do that better, I would not be here.
All right. Agatha?
Sure. So I'm Agatha. I'm running for Congress to make government more responsive and reflective of the people. And because we have a national audience and because I have San Francisco roots, I also want to remind people, I think it's important to remind people on who lives in the district and what it means to reflect the district. So my family has been in San Francisco for over 30 years. I went to college here. My little sister currently goes to high school here. So there's 3 generations of my family that are in San Francisco. We are the capital of Silicon Valley. The technology that is built here affects the entire world. Our future will be dominated by AI, social media monopolies, and automation. And so we need a candidate, a politician, a representative who is sophisticated about humane technology. We all saw the hearings on Facebook, how wildly incompetent our current legislative body is in governing in that area. As an engineer, as a designer, and as a social justice advocate, I am someone who looks at systems and sees how they are designed and who they're serving and knows how to build systems to serve all of us. I think I really appreciate how Shahid said that he's an intersectional feminist, but I do think the fact that I'm a woman matters and there needs to be a female candidate on that ballot. San Franciscans have one of the only female mayors in the country. We have 2 female senators, and we have the first female Speaker of the House. Only 20% of Congress are women, and if we continue the rate of electing women in Congress, we will not get to gender parity in over 90 years. There needs to be more women on that ballot. I would also point out that San Francisco is one of the youngest districts in the country. 41% of registered voters are millennials, and yet there are so many more young people that need to be inspired and that need to be brought to the ballot, and that is empowering for our democracy. And I'll just conclude by, I didn't even mention the immigrant thing. Just having someone, I live in the Mission, which is the Latin neighborhood of San Francisco, and I talk to people in their language, in Spanish, in Portuguese, and people come to me with energy and say, one of us is running? Wow, that matters, being able for a leader to talk directly with constituents. And last, I'll end with my frame for how I see where we are as a country. So I think it's in our history that at independence, we transitioned from the rule of one person, King George III, to the rule of a 1% system of Congress and money. And finally, 230 years later, we are able to evolve once again to represent 100% of the people. And we will do that through a progressive movement by organizing people and building technologies and tools to make government more responsive in real time.
And lastly, Shahid?
Thanks again, Joy, for bringing us together, and I'll thank my allies in the race for raising their voices to challenge the corporate co-optation of the Democratic Party. And maybe I'll just start with a piece that Agatha had referenced with respect to humane tech. And for the last 5 years, I've worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I built a national grassroots network of nearly 90 organizations in 30 different states that are doing the hard work of working with concerned Americans every day in their respective communities to learn how to stay safe and secure online, to learn how to restrain government surveillance at the local level, like the law I just helped get passed in San Francisco to ban face surveillance in the hands of government agencies. It's the first of its kind across the country, and it will not be the last. That campaign reveals, I think, and reflects the acumen that I bring to the race, the 20 years of history that I've spent building the progressive movement, from marriage equality to peace and justice, from privacy in the face of mass surveillance to executive accountability for a criminal president. As I look at this race, it's very clear to me that San Francisco deserves a voice in Washington that is willing to champion our city's consensus on defending and expanding human rights. I can do that. We know that San Francisco deserves a champion in Washington who is willing to stand by our community's commitment to climate justice. I can do that. I do that more or less every day. We need a voice in Congress who's willing to stand in favor of the human rights that are threatened at the border. I do that. Just yesterday, I was at the headquarters of Palantir with a mobilization challenging the company not to sell fascist tech to the government. I've done this work with respect to net neutrality. I've done this work with respect to defending the right to encryption. There is certainly no one in this race who's done nearly as much as I have in defending the right of access to humane tech, to trying to restrain the military-industrial complex, to seeking accountability at the CIA or the NSA or the FBI for those various agencies' litany of crimes against the American people. And I've done more to defend the rights of my neighbors, frankly, than other campaigns that have seeking the opportunity to represent our city in Washington. These are just a few of the reasons why some of the other endorsers I haven't mentioned yet include a labor law professor at the University of California, Hastings, who I had a chance to mentor when she was an undergrad. That's Vina Duval. Our endorsers include Valerie Carr, who's an icon in the Sikh American community, Medea Benjamin, who founded Code Pink. And the reason these women have endorsed our campaign is because they recognize that my depth of experience, the depth of my commitment, and the range of different ways in which I've built the community and the progressive movement don't have a close parallel. And it's one reason why, again, I'm very confident that we'll have a chance to liberate this seat to represent San Francisco and Washington, and I look very forward to that future.
All right. Well, I thank you guys so much. Can we just go real quick, and so you guys can give your website, your Twitter, all that stuff, if you want to continue?
Sure. Folks can visit us online at www.shahidforchange.us, and you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Shahid for Change.
Agatha?
My website is agathaforcongress.com. On Twitter, I am at Agatha Bacelar, and on Instagram, I am at Aggie Bacelar, A-G-G-I-E.
Awesome. And Tom?
Tom Gallagher, Congress 2020, at Tom Congress.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. This has been awesome. Really great debate. It definitely could have went on, there may have to be a round two. I don't know, guys. Uh-oh, crickets. So, but thank you so much for doing this. I know it was very like spur of the moment. I just got the idea and you guys embraced it. So thank you guys. I wish you all the best of luck. You're all three of you are awesome. So I really appreciate this and best of luck. Let's unseat Pelosi, please. So much love. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again for doing this.
Absolutely.
Oh, joy. Go there.